So hello everyone, and welcome to Debra and Peter are doing a podcast with me, Peter Wanless, president of the Vitality Blast 2020 cricket champions for the second time in 3 years, Somerset County Cricket Club, and Deborah Alcott-Tyler, the chief executive of the Directory of Social Change. How are you, Deborah?
I'm all right. I've been thinking that perhaps we ought to rename our podcast Peter and Deborah Talk Cricket. It's been pointed out by somebody that it's very rare that one of our pod goes past without some mention of cricket. I said, well, that's because we both love it.
Yeah, and I do have a role. It's a part of my and I like to think that we're talking about it indirectly.
Yeah.
But
we are. I'm teasing.
You can't win a trophy and not feel great about it, and I feel great about it, and the team feel great about it, and
so you should, Peter. That was a triumphant win, and also, as we've discussed in previous podcasts, creating a winning cricket team requires leadership, communication, collaboration,
meetings.
Meetings, yeah, exactly. So it is relevant. The listener who commented about the cricket.
But let's move swiftly on. And another thing that's been happening, of course, this week is the occasion of a hugely important visit. And in my case, it's the visit of my brother-in-law, the first external guest to our place in Somerset. And so we've been wanting to put on a show there. But for the rest of the country, it's the state visit of Donald Trump. Is he or isn't he? And I think as we speak, he's due to fly into Stansted. And I guess people have got mixed feelings about that.
He's flying into Stansted?
I believe so.
I'm sorry, that makes me, I've no disrespect for Stansted, but that does tend to be where the low-budget airlines fly out from. I find that quite amusing.
I'm sure he'll be on his usual vehicle, but I'm not quite sure what happens after he touches down, other than that there's lots going on in Windsor, I think.
Well, I was hearing that as well as the protests against Trump in London, they're also organising some in the streets of Windsor, so he won't entirely escape the anti-Trump protests. Yeah.
Well, everyone's protesting at the moment, aren't they? What about over the weekend?
Yeah, there's been a lot of real upset in our sector. In all of the forums and the meetings I've been to, and with staff and things like that about what happened. And it's a challenging thing, isn't it? Because clearly not everybody who went on that protest was a far right thug. Although when you looked at the group of people, you'd be hard pushed not to say that they were. And what I'm finding interesting is that how we're de-escalating the scale of the problem by people saying things like, they're not racist marches. These people have got legitimate concerns. I've spoken about this before, legitimate concerns. And actually, the trouble is they're marching. The march is about anti-immigration, particularly asylum seekers and refugees. And those are not legitimate concerns. There are legitimate concerns about housing, about health, and about wealth. But immigrants have got nothing to do with any of those things at all. And so it isn't legitimate to link immigration with those challenges that we face. And in fact, I was saying to a colleague, the reality is if you think about the health in particular, but also housing, health and housing employ a huge number of immigrants to carry out the work. And if we didn't have those immigrants, we'd be even more of a pickle. And I think it's one of our colleagues in the sector who, said we have to call it what it is. You can't soften it by saying it's not really about racism, it's about all these other things, when quite clearly the overtones are racist, the reporting's racist, it's being fronted by Tommy Robinson and, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, very uncomfortable, and lots of colleagues really upset. And we're back, it feels back again a bit to the riots of last summer, with people feeling uncomfortable about where to go. And in fact, as we were having a meeting today, I won't say who because I don't want to thingy, but one of the people in the meeting got a message in the middle of the meeting to say that one of their members of staff had their front door of their house painted with the flag. Someone had gone and painted St George's flag on their house.
Because
they're a black person.
Because they're black. It's terrible.
So it's, and I'm beginning to think that now, we almost like we make it okay when we say, but these people have got legitimate concerns. It's like, yes, And if you want to complain about housing and health, go and march outside Parliament and talk about housing and health. Don't use immigration as an excuse, but I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of people who I just kind of come across in day-to-day life feeling anxious about a sense of things not working and being overwhelmed. And then there is this association being made, absolutely, with a certain sector of the population, whereas
but it's deliberately being made, Peter. That's the trouble. It's deliberately being made by the likes of Farage, by Reform members, by some members of our own government, and linking, or at least they're not delinking it. They're not saying these concerns are valid and we need to tackle them. Linking it with immigration is not valid, So it's the problem. The problem is this hasn't happened by accident. It's been fueled, and actually, again, I've been thinking about this, and I was sort of wondering, because we've always had racism. Every country experiences racism. But sort of after the sort of 80s, really, it kind of wasn't socially acceptable to be openly racist or to make openly racist remarks. But now all of a sudden it's different. It's like people feel that it's okay, it's legitimized to do it. And it's since Brexit. The whole debate around Brexit somehow or other seems to have given people permission to be racist and nasty and bigoted, and to do it openly, and they bang on about British values. But I'd be like, what about the British values of tolerance and respect and good manners? It's not actually very good manners to set fire to somebody's bloody dwelling because you're angry about, the fact your granny couldn't get an appointment with a GP.
No, a United Kingdom.
Yes.
It doesn't feel very united. No. It feels very disunited and polarizing. I agree with you absolutely. I mean, there's some echoes of in terms of trying to understand why things have got this way. I mean, you might say Brexit is a factor, but challenging economic circumstances are.
We've always had those.
Another. Well,
we've always had, there's always been a period of time when the country hasn't had any money, when people have been broke. There's always been a problem with health and housing and wealth inequality. The thing is, these circumstances are not new, and yet people are using them to justify so people behaving the way they're behaving, and it's not okay. We've always had these challenges. We didn't have, in the massive crash of 2008 when everybody was struggling, it was a complete and utter nightmare. We didn't have anti-immigration marches or racism on the streets. This is why I make the link with Brexit, is that something happened there. However, having said that, Peter, our lovely Jose, who listeners will know, produce our podcast, did a really lovely post. So he's been back in Spain visiting his family for the last couple of weeks, and he drove back and obviously had to come through the port of Dover, and he had to go through the customs checks. One of the border officers obviously asked him where he'd been and where he was going. Yeah. And Jose said it just really filled him with reassurance when the border officer, and Jose has a very strong Spanish accent. He's very clearly, has been brought up in another country.
Yeah.
And when the border officer said something like, "Welcome home, travel safely," Jose did this whole piece about how actually the vast majority of the country are not bigoted, angry, in-your-face racists. It's a small number who are very loud, and that we just need to remember that our neighbours and our friends and our colleagues generally don't behave like that. So I found that very reassuring, that post.
Yes, I did read that, and I thought the same. That is a lovely expression of integration and
welcoming
and
although it helps
and
that
kindness.
White, of course.
Yeah, maybe I don't know. It would be interesting to know what training the border guards get, or if that's something that comes naturally to them.
Yeah, that's very true. I hope it's training, actually. I know, you prefer it to come naturally, but I really hope they're told that they have to. But, this stuff is colour-coded, Peter, because I have not seen or heard of any reports of people camping outside places that housed Ukrainians. I've never heard anybody say, why did Ukrainians stay in Poland? That was a safe country that they came from. Or those who came via France, why didn't they stay in France? I haven't heard anybody saying they need to be sent back to Ukraine. I haven't even heard anyone saying, because Ukraine is massive and Western Ukraine is relatively protected from the bullets and the bombs and the missiles at the moment. So they could have just gone west in their own countries. Now, I'm not saying they should have. They're very welcome here as far as I'm concerned, as is everybody. But that's what makes me say this is colour-coded, because nobody is talking about Ukrainian refugees.
Yeah. Rather, I mean, it's rather the reverse. There was a great kind of national pride in what we did to step up and help the Ukrainians.
People off with their homes, you know.
But then there's a bogeyman and a polarized kind of aggressor there in Putin, which our press and popular opinion have kind of galvanized against. So you've got someone to hate. Now he's not black, but he has been portrayed through all sorts of communications as a hate figure, and it helps. I think probably in that context. You did say in that little mini rant that you had there, you said Ukrainians are welcome, as are everyone, so far as I'm concerned, and that is where it gets. That's where it gets difficult, and that's what triggers, a number of people who feel anxious that there are open borders and that everyone isn't welcome, really, because you do have to have controlled immigration.
Yeah, that's why we've got to keep telling them, Peter, that the fears they have are unfounded fears. It's not true. It's not true that it's uncontrolled. It's not true that half of them are rapists. It's not true. All these things that they think are true are simply not true. They're not living off the state in endless luxury. They're living in massive poverty, most of them, which is why there are so many charities to try and help them when they're in the country.
Yeah.
So we've got to keep telling people that what they believe is wrong. And we've got to stop saying to people your concerns are legitimate when they're not. As Andy, my partner, pointed out at the weekend, he said, the fact that people have concerns doesn't necessarily mean they're legitimate, they're just concerns. And what people need is the facts and information to help them know that actually that concern I had is unfounded. I don't need to be worried about that. Remember we were talking about Freddie Flintoff's Field of Dreams?
Yeah.
So this is actually not about cricket. This is about immigration and refugees and asylum seekers. In the very first one, there was a young... So you know how everybody moans about all these refugees and asylum seekers Seekers are young men, obviously like young teenage men largely. And in that first programme, I've completely forgotten his name, but there was a refugee from Afghanistan, a young chap who turned out to be really... That's the chap, Adnan. He turned out to be a super talented cricketer and had learned his skills basically with a bit of wood and, an apple or something. But when you saw him and heard his story and saw his journey, there's no way you looked at that young man and thought thug or, it's like when you hear the stories and when you meet the people, it becomes different. It's when we think of it as a generic blob of a load of men marauding through the things. When you hear the stories, you realise it isn't that. So anybody listening who wants to know why there are young men coming over here, go and have a look at the first season of Freddie Flintoff's Field of Dreams, and you'll meet Adnan, who's a sublime young man as far as I'm concerned.
But I think that I agree with you 100%, and each individual case is strong.
Yeah.
But the public debate is conditioned by a succession of politicians from all our main parties making promises that immigration is going to be controlled, and it's going to be controlled at a certain level, and then week after week after week, we get figures that are way beyond the figures that they say the immigration is going to be controlled at. So is it any wonder that at an aggregate level, a number of people who don't spend their time thinking about these things believe that the nation is being overrun, especially when they can't get a doctor's appointment and they can't get their kid into the school of their choice. So
but it's not because of immigration, Peter. That's the point I'm going to keep making, which I know you know, but I'm going to keep making, that we have to keep making that point. Because the other problem is that, again, everybody's brought into the idea that immigration is a problem. But what if it isn't a problem? What if we don't see it as a problem? What if we see it differently? Now, I don't see immigration as a problem. I see immigration as a positive thing. I see us taking in refugees, asylum seekers as, honouring our international obligations, also, fixing some of the mess that our actions in the past have created, and also contributing to this dynamic society. We already know birth rates are falling. We need young people of working age to be working and earning enough money to pay taxes, to pay our pensions and stuff like that. So it's just like they all jump on the yes, we know immigration's a problem. On what basis is it a problem? Well, explain that to me properly. It's a problem because people are prejudiced against immigrants, but is it actually a problem in the vast scheme of things? How much of a problem is it? And interestingly, again, up until Brexit, when, whoever it is who does that big opinion poll, that survey of British views about stuff, I mean, loads of them do it, but whenever you're asked about what do people worry about, immigration's never been anywhere near the top of the agenda. It's been way down. It's been housing, it's been health, it's been access, it's been, whatever, but it's not, immigration's never been in the top few. But it came in the top few once it started being jumped on.
Yeah.
Again, my perception is largely through Brexit. And so now all of a sudden it's the hot topic in the country when it's one of the least biggest problems. We have way bigger problems in this country than the number of immigrants. And that's what we've got to keep telling people.
Well, I mean, another thing that happened, and I recall the meetings on this, is that when immigration is managed well and carefully and shared proportionately across the country, people can be integrated successfully. And sometimes we do that when there's a influx of people from a particular country at a concentrated period of time, as happened with Ukraine. As happened, I remember my granddad did amazing stuff with all sorts of people from the community back in the day when the Vietnamese boat people came across, and there's huge national pride in that. But I do remember when a decision was taken to because there were sufficient numbers of people coming over that for whatever reason numbers of local authorities weren't taking the unprocessed refugees and asylum seekers, and there were impossible numbers in Kent, then these people were put into these hotels. And as children's charities, we sort of came together on behalf of the children and said, this is not how we manage vulnerable young people. You don't just bung them in a hotel and assume everything will be fine, because they're not clients of a hotel. They have particular needs and vulnerabilities, which there are people in local authorities and know and understand how to do this well. But no, this is a temporary measure and we're going to do it for a period of time. And then everyone disowns this kind of hotels thing, and it has become a real problem because it's not really been thought through. And they're also
awful living conditions for the refugees and asylum seekers. They're not pleasant conditions. They're not living in a room getting, room service and all the rest of it. Many of them are sharing rooms inappropriately. You often have whole families squished, so they're not even nice conditions in these hotels.
Except they can look to some of those communities like the nice hotels that they had in their town, not being used for people to come and be tourists or attend business meetings or whatever, but this concentration of people who don't look like them and behave like them, and then
also because of course the hotels make a lot of money out of it. One of the reasons why the hotels do it is because my understanding is that they get paid for the room, whether the room's being used or not. So they're paying for the whole facility. So it's a very, very steady source of income for hotels, which is why, and in fact, even I think it was Epping, even in Epping, the hotel owners were fighting against the council for saying that they couldn't house refugees because that's their livelihood. They're making money out of it, so it's. Anyway,
the government's going to get a grip because it's had a reshuffle, and so everyone who knew what they were doing, if they didn't know what they were doing, is now doing something else. And I was starting to think about this. It is very, and I can rationalise this as a formal civil servant, and the kind, the freshness and the leadership and the perspective individuals doing, it is not the same being a minister as being the functional leader of a particular bit of an organisation. But it's slightly bizarre, isn't it? Can you imagine a charity just deciding, things aren't going quite the way we would like them to, we're going to make our head of HR our commercial director and our IT expert.
That's a brilliant analogy, Peter. And also it's so frustrating. I mean, nothing's changed for us in the charity sector. We've got Lisa and Andy and Steph Peacock, who, to be honest, none of us have seen or heard of, from since she joined, really. But anyway, but it's the others where they've now got to start all over again with relationships. And of course, every minister, whether they're, Secretary of State level or whether they're a junior minister, comes in wanting to do things their way. So things that, because these people have only been in post for a year, and it's like a year's no time. You can't make a difference in a year. It's especially in the machineries of government where it's, it's more complicated and more bureaucratic and everything sort of knocks onto everything else. You can't just go and do stuff. So I hate the bloody reshuffles. And I think reshuffles are always about what's good for the political party, not what's good for the country. It's like repaying favours and all that sort of thing. I'm glad he didn't change Rachel Reeves, even though he's been under a lot of pressure to do that. But he did move Yvette Cooper to foreign, which should be, I'm a fan of Yvette Cooper. I think she'll do a great job. But, I still think she was, with some exceptions, so I didn't agree with everything. But,
some of
the
some of the most successful times that I can remember in government were when we had a Secretary of State for an extended period. Yeah. I mean, I can't remember if I've talked about working for and with David Blunkett before on this podcast. My goodness, he was a really challenging person to have as the Secretary of State, but he was there for the whole of the first Blair administration, and you got to kind of know what he thought about things and what was important. And I think he would say, like everyone else, he knew quite a lot coming in and what he wanted to do, but he learned on the job and developed. And then you got the reverse of that in terms of children's ministers. We must have had at least one children's minister a year for the last 10 years. But just taking it into the charity, how long do you reckon you need to be a successful leader of a charity? Is it as simple as?
Well, I don't know if there's averages. Like when people say you should leave after 5 to 7 years, it's like I don't think you should make any of us should make blanket sorts of things. I mean, when I first came to DSC, for the first 2 years, I absolutely hated it. I was utterly miserable, and they didn't like me much either. I got anonymous hate mail from a member of staff, and it was so bad they'd literally taken the time to cut out letters from newspapers and magazines to send this hate mail. So it was really challenging in the first 2 years, definitely. But then I settled in and, personnel changed and you're sort of able to make it more your own. So I don't know if there's any hard and fast rules. I think it's a lot longer than people think it is. And I also think that, I can't remember the name of the book now, so I'm going to have to do it post this podcast. But there's a very interesting book written about leadership where it's said that people tend to attribute, great organizations with great leadership. They said, but if you actually sit down and look at it, very often the leaders who have a reputation for being great tend to leave and move on to the next thing, which they do stuff to. Whereas if you look at the people who stay over a long period of time, there's 7 years when the organisation is doing really well and they're called great, and then there's a period of time when the organisation does less well. In other words, I think a lot of it is down to luck and timing. Like, is it if you move into for example, if you started as a chief executive in a charity during the time of the last Labour government, you were quids in, because it was a friendly government towards the sector. There was loads of money sloshing around. It was quite difficult not to benefit from that. If you take that same person as a new chief executive in the last 10 years, then it would be a very different picture, because the environment isn't as conducive to success. So I think as leaders, we also have to be super humble and recognise that, when things are going well, it's not all about us. Just as when things are going badly, it is all about us. But you know what I mean?
There was a post on LinkedIn this week which Steve Allman did, and he's a bit of an acquired taste. I quite like it. I quite like his posts because they trigger me, and sometimes I respond to them, but usually I don't. And he his basic shtick is to encourage people to remember that everyone's human and they're good, and everyone around them is the problem kind of lies with them, which is kind of true up to a point. But anyway, he did this thing about it's okay to quit, and how if you stay doing something which is making you unhappy, it's not good for you, and sometimes the best thing you can do is step back and do something else. And I do appreciate and understand that perspective, but equally I feel rather strongly, and echoing something that you've just said, that there are people that come in, shake things up for 2 years, go off somewhere else, shake things up for 2 years. And it's much more stressful to be having to cope with their mess and their unresolved mess than it is for them to stick with the consequences of what it is they've decided to do to organisation. So I did put a little kind of comment to that effect, which slightly it doesn't undermine his case, because as he says, my posts are one issue posts, but they do sort of deliberately put one side of a case, and I do feel at the moment that these are challenging times to be a leader, aren't they? And if too many of our leaders take comfort in the fact that I could be doing something else that'd be a lot more fun, and step back, then we will face some difficulty. And again, I look back at your book. It's tough at the top, and the advice that the leaders give to other people, and this is another bit of my advice to other leaders, which you publish in the book. If it feels tough, it is, but others have placed confidence in you to lead them through this. If it were all straightforward, you wouldn't be needed. And then I said in brackets, I constantly have to tell myself this one. and I did do that over and over again. There were definitely periods in my 11 and a half years at the NSPCC where I felt super challenged and I can't do this job, and it is all too much. And it would have been quite easy to
walk away.
And now it's harder for me to make this little speech because I have walked away and I am doing something else, and I am feeling very happy in my new house, and Somerset have just won the T20. But I wouldn't want anyone to get the wrong impression that I left because it was all too difficult and impossible. I think leading charities, it's a huge privilege. It's exciting, interesting, important, and difficult work. And my goodness, it is difficult at the moment. And it's okay to say it's difficult. There's a lovely interview which Mark Russell, the chief executive of the Children's Society, and one of our keen listeners has done this week, Third Sector Podcast, where he talks about the vulnerability of leadership, and that it's okay to say it's difficult. So I don't know where I'm going with this little speech, other than that I want to encourage leaders who are currently leading their charities to not to just think the best thing to do is quit, because we need you.
Well, it's about making the distinction between it being tough and it making you miserable. And I think there are two different things there. The reality is this job, exactly as you said, Peter, it's tough. You know, if people are experiencing the job as hard, it's because it is hard, because the challenges are hard, the environment's hard. We're often dealing with causes that other people don't care about. I mean, it's just a really tough job, and you just get to, and I, always want to say to new chief executive or aspiring chief executive, it's a really tough, really lonely job. You need to prepare yourself for that, That's different, though, when somebody's like operating under absolute misery because they've got a shit board or their staff all hate them. I mean, to be honest, my first 2 years at DSC, the only thing that kept me there was I will not let those bastards bully me out of this organisation. Absolutely no way. I will go when I choose to go, not because you bullied me out. So it was stubbornness, really. But it was making me miserable. I just refused to go, and I'm glad I didn't. Because I'm now, all these years later, I absolutely love it. I love the people, I love the work, I love the cause. So that's the only caveat I would say, is just be really clear that if you're having a bad day or a shit time because it's tough and it's difficult, that's not necessarily the reason to leave.
Yeah.
But if it is genuinely affecting your mental health and making you unable to function as a functioning human being, then that's fine. Yeah. That's all I would say, the caveat about it.
And certainly in my experience, I have felt as a chief executive, I've had options in these circumstances.
Yeah.
Now, there are occasions, if you've fallen out with your board or another something, then that is a challenge. Whereas if you're in the middle of an organisation, or if you're kind of on the way up and people around you are making your job impossible, there've been a couple of occasions in my whole career where I felt miserable, and that has been the reason. It's because I've been working for someone or in a team who haven't given me the ability or opportunity to do what it is they're expecting of me, because they're not sharing the information or not allowing me to attend the meetings, and then you need to find the life is too short.
Yeah, it is. But also, we don't talk very much about bullying upwards. And that's as prevalent. We always talk about bullying as a downwards thing. It's like somebody with power, and the power is perceived as status power. But actually, there's the power of the mob. There's the power of the gossip. There's the power of the, conspiracy, if you know what I mean. It's I remember when I was first at DSC, when I used to walk into meetings, everybody would just stop speaking and they wouldn't engage with me. And I remember one particular person who used to work at DSC, whenever I was talking about anything, she would exchange glances with a colleague, that kind of like lifting your eyes up and looking, so a lot of it was non-verbal, which is incredibly difficult to call out. So I think people think bullying is just one way, but it definitely isn't. You can bully. I mean, I've come across chief executives who've been horribly bullied by their staff to the extent, and you could say, well, you should have known how to win them round, but actually, that's not always possible. But
what's your advice in those circumstances?
Oh God, that's a good question. What's your advice? Well, call it out, I think. So I used to say, to this person, let me make up a name, Jasmine. Yeah. I say, Jasmine, you looked unclear about that. I saw you exchange a glance with Jose. What was bothering you? So I would take it at face value. Or when I had, staff coming to say, people think X, Y, Z, I would always ask which people. And if they would then say, well, I'm not going to tell you who, I say, well, there's nothing I can do about it. No. Like, is it everybody? And I always have a trick. So, like, especially at DSC, so we have a member of staff called Shireen Mustafa Jahal, who is just a source of joy and inspiration and positivity, and just nobody ever has a bad word to say about her. And whenever someone would come to me and say, people think, I would say, what, Shireen? And I said, no, not Shireen. And I'd say, do you think this? And so I would always just try and take it at face value in the sense of genuinely engaging with so who thinks this then? Is it you? So my advice would be to call it out, don't ignore it. And you can do it with non-verbal stuff without being aggressive. As I said, you can say, you look puzzled there, Peter. Or Peter, you looked a little bit cross just then. Is everything okay? Was there something you wanted to say? And if you do it in that gentle, inviting voice, well, I don't have a gentle voice, but you know what I mean? If you do it in a way that it creates the space. So that's what I would advise. Don't ignore it, call it out. I ignored it for a couple of years. And then in the end, I stopped ignoring it and called it out. And it changed very quickly.
Oh, it was worth having the conversation today. I love that advice. Thank you. I'm going to practice that somewhere. It feels a really honest way of addressing what could otherwise be a really uncomfortable situation.
Yeah. And what is often dishonest behaviour, but without accusing people, Anyway, I think
we better leave it there. Yeah, I think we have for this week. I don't know if I'm going to be able to do next week. We need to have a conversation off air about if we can manage it. Next week is our birthday week.
It is our birthday week, Peter. I mean, we can't not send out a podcast on our birthday. We'll have to try and find a way to do it. We'll have a chat.
I may have to do it from a remote location, but that could be exciting.
That could be exciting. Okay.
All right, then. Great.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks.
Folks.
See you
next week, I hope so. Bye.
Bye.